All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, depending on where you are joining us from. This is, of course, a transatlantic conversation, so my hunch is that it's either 4 p.m. for you or maybe 10 a.m. or 7 a.m. on this side of the Atlantic. I'm happy to welcome you to the study group with our Fisher Family Fellow Ambassador Peter Wittig. This is really, we intend this to be entirely, truly a study group, which is to say, Ambassador Wittig will open with a couple of thoughts and remarks on well, I think we can probably say this. It was in many ways a historic week last week, marking the 100 days of the Biden presidency because of how the Biden presidency has been categorized in history and the comparisons that have been made to the transformational impact even these 100 days have had, and he'll share that with us. But then it's really time for you to, lean in and ask as many questions, offer your comments and thoughts so that we truly have a transatlantic and wide-ranging conversation. All of you will know the incredibly and deeply accomplished diplomatic career of Ambassador Wittig. This is the second study group we've had together, but you have before you someone who is deeply versed in European Union politics and affairs. His last diplomatic post was, of course, as the German ambassador to
Catherine, we can't hear you. So while Catherine's getting that sorted, Ambassador was the German ambassador to the UN, the German ambassador to the UK, the German ambassador to the US. So he's held a variety of very important critical posts for the transatlantic relationship and multilateral organizations. Catherine, I see you're back.
Oh, good. Yes, sorry, I should have warned. I'm having technical difficulties this morning, so we're tag teaming the introduction to this conversation. So maybe for that reason, we should hand straight over to a better technical line all the way from Berlin, and Ambassador Peter Wittig. Welcome, Peter. Happy to have you.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Erica. It's a pleasure to be with you. This transatlanticist group. I hope you're all well and in good spirits. I guess most of you are already vaccinated. When you are in the US, the likelihood is much greater, but the campaign, the vaccination campaign here in Germany is picking up. The mood is picking up. We are at 1 million a day almost, so the spirits are higher than they used to be a couple of weeks ago. I think a lot of articles have appeared, 100 days of Biden in the last days. I guess most of them sort of focused on domestic affairs. So maybe it's fitting to see this through the angle of transatlantic relations, also in view of the upcoming summit in mid-June, the US-EU summit. So it's good to take stock where we are after 3 or 4 months by then. Now, I will make some remarks, first of all, a little bit from the European perspective, and then I try to put myself in the shoes of the American side and make some remarks on how the EU was doing and Germany in particular, transatlantically. So let's go through the big issues that are on our joint agenda, transatlantic agenda. But first, maybe a remark on the personality of the new president. I think the perception of Biden really has changed. Most European leaders and the decision makers and public opinion expected sort of an elderly, well-known gentleman, a moderator, a bridge builder, strong on values, maybe less strong on policies. And they were surprised to see another different Biden, a potential game changer, a game-changing president, ambitious, bold, determined, and the Europeans were quite taken aback, quite frankly, by his fiscal and social policies, rather radical, according to our expectations. So what we've seen was a rather a left social democrat from European style, if you will, and that very few people have expected. Now, in terms of his pledges, or the administration's pledges, to once again return to multilateralism, to cooperations with allies, to once again cherish alliances. I think here most Europeans would say Biden really delivered on his pledges, most notably when he addressed the Munich Security Conference virtually. This was really a big, feat of transatlantic love, specifically on his commitment to NATO. Blinken visited Brussels twice, reassuring the Europeans. Of course, there was a re-engagement with multilateral organizations, from the WHO to the WTO. So I think here everybody is happy and said, yes, he delivered what he has pledged. Climate policy, of course, is a key in transatlantic relations. And here it looks as if this administration is the most environmentally friendly ever. And I think that has really enthused most Europeans here and met with great applause. The targets and the national climate plan, and of course the budget that is behind it, not yet endorsed, but sort of the layout of that climate policy is quite impressive according to European expectations. We have hope of a joint kind of climate alliance, EU, US, UK as host of the next COP26. We hope that together we can really be leaders in global climate policy. So there is really an opportunity of a transatlantic climate bridge here. Now, there are interesting convergences of views. I mean, I read in a trade report that the administration is even considering carbon border adjustment measures, something that has been, of course, in the past always a total taboo. I don't know whether that will come to that. I'm rather skeptical, but in general, there is a lot of convergence, maybe with one exception, and that is the CO2 pricing. This is something that I guess Biden doesn't want to burden the American taxpayer with, and this might be a divergence that becomes sort of more important going forward, because this is basically the European emission trading system. This is basically our approach, and also I would say sort of more market friendly than the regulatory approach. But all in all, great convergence of views. Now, trade and international taxation. This is, of course, a little bit a mixed picture. On the positive side, the suspension of the Boeing Airbus tariffs, good sign for an agreement eventually. What Europeans were really surprised by is this suggestion of this US initiative on a global minimum corporate tax, and an US initiative to give states, countries taxing rights over international businesses that are present in their countries, like the Facebooks and Apples of this world, without really, or with a very low tax base. So this was really welcomed, particularly by France and Germany. Also, the efforts to revitalize the WTO is on the plus side. Less positive from a European point of view in trade issues is that the steel and aluminum tariffs are still in effect. The Buy American policy that was spelled out by President, of course, is understandable. This is a policy for the middle class. but this did not really go down very well with Brussels or with member states. And now EU is even thinking of sort of retaliating, in inverted commas, reciprocating the ban on procurement by, on US procurement for European states. Now that this is not yet, it's a plan, but you can see here there are protectionist forces in the US, which we acknowledge, by the way, also in Europe. So I would say here on trade, Biden will not be a transformational president. That is what we believe, and Europeans are probably a little bit disappointed. Had probably expected more of a free trading spirit here. So trade-wise, this is really a mixed balance, I would say, but there are some perspectives. For instance, the EU suggested a joint trade and technology council. I think that is still sort of a proposition that might be one day be realized. Big topic in the last weeks, Russia, Ukraine. Russia's military threat against Ukraine was a big test for the Biden administration. I think here the European intelligence services, from what I have heard, never thought this would be an invasion that was looming, but it was, of course, another sign of Putin's unpredictable behavior, tactics. I think the reaction was a good one, a joint reaction, joint action also to ward off that threat. Blinken's visit to Ukraine was a strong sign that the that the US cares. Navalny, the sanctions in the Navalny case were coordinated. That was also a good sign. But apart from those joint reactions on that recent crisis, I would still say we have a difference in threat perspectives. I mean, especially Germany and France, not so much Eastern Europeans like Poland and the Baltic states have a different threat perception than the US. Its geographic proximity, its interests, economic interests that are dividing us in the assessment of Russia, and I think that is will continue to some degree. I think what unites us is both of us have very, very low expectations that there is any path to a substantial improvement of relations under Putin with Russia. So I think we don't harbor immense hopes that with Putin's Russia there will be any kind of reset. Sorry. Am I still on? Yeah. Thank you. My phone just rang. So now we come to the big issue, China. That's probably one of the biggest, litmus tests of transatlantic relations. Sorry, I have to. My family has a habit to call. I have 4 kids, and my family has a habit to disturb me in the most decisive moments, and this is one. So China, a big litmus test. I would say on an optimistic note, there is an opportunity for a joint agenda, US-European agenda on China. I think we could manage to rebalance our relationship with China between partnership, competition, and rivalry. If we do it right, we acted jointly on sanctions against China on Xinjiang, on the Uyghurs. That was, a sign that China understood. China retaliated promptly and in a pretty robust way. And I think this is also a new sort of an important moment to realize that China will, in its own perception, will not be bullied by the West. So we can reckon in the future, whenever we impose sanctions, China will react rather swiftly and robustly. We have also some convergence on views that divided us before. Huawei, for instance, sort of Germany joined other countries in raising the barriers for Huawei's participation in G5. If you look at their latest statement of the G7 foreign ministers that just met in London, you could also see that there is a rather tough line, a common tough line on China. But on the other hand, the EU, quite frankly, and Germany in particular, they are worried that we will be kind of dragged into a Cold War 2.0 here. There are differences in economic interests. Europe is a export-orientated economy, Germany in particular. So we also defend the EU agreement that was signed in principle last December, the comprehensive agreement on investment that was much criticized. The EU has become more assertive in trade issues. EU is defining its trade policy as open strategic open strategic autonomy. So here we have a certain assertiveness of the European Union in terms of economic relations to China, in terms of trade to China. And I detect also a certain alignment in recent months between France and Germany on China. Those two countries are doing a lot together on China, sort of when they are on the phone with Chinese leadership, etc. A word on the Indo-Pacific. Here, I think we are totally behind what the new U.S. emphasis on the. It's not so new, but the continued emphasis on the Indo-Pacific. Germany followed suit with its own Indo-Pacific strategy. The EU has published a strategy on the Indo-Pacific, although it was criticized as much too weak. So there is a tendency here to diversify sort of the economic investment in Asia, and also to be more participating in defending rule of law and also security in the region. You might be laughing about this, but Germany decided to send a frigate to the South China Sea, one frigate. But this is a symbol and a gesture that we want to be present when it comes to upholding international law in the South China Sea. I skipped the regional issues, Iran, JCPOA, and Afghanistan. We accepted this withdrawal, I think, with grumblings in the security establishment. I think some countries thought we should have coordinated this better, this withdrawal decision. There's still 7,000 allied troops there, and of course they also will have to leave without the enabling forces of the U.S. But that's not a big. That was not a big. I think breach or a big rupture or fissure here. Now, just coming to a close of my remarks, if I want to put myself into the shoes of an American member of the government, for instance, or journalist, I would maybe say Europeans and Germany's reaction to Biden's overture has been a little bit too passive. And I would even, share that view. I'm not part of the government anymore, so I can speak totally freely here. There were some important gestures. The US decided to stop Trump's troop withdrawal and even announced a small increase of American troops in Germany. That was a nice gesture. Blinken gave important signals. He said, yes, the 2% goal is important, but it's not the only yardstick. And, we can also justify this by saying we are strengthening European defense, and the US wouldn't mind. And also he said something important in Brussels when he met his foreign ministerial colleagues. He said the US will not force allies to choose between the US and China. This was an important statement. But there's one sticking point that is still out there and also publicly out there, that's Nord Stream 2. And here I have to sort of report that German political leaders are totally divided on this, and maybe the mood with the Navalny case has slightly shifted against Nord Stream 2 pipeline, in particular in Chancellor Merkel's party. Yet few would say we should totally abandon that pipeline. It should just keep on rotting in the seabeds. Most say let's use it. Let's maybe go for a moratorium and use this pipeline as a negotiation chip with Russia and turn it into a sort of a trump card with Russia. And Wolfgang Ischinger has just published an article with a couple of suggestions in Foreign Affairs. So there is a discussion, and the Navalny case has given some tailwinds to the critics of Nord Stream 2 in Germany. Now, briefly, many transatlanticists, and I include myself in that group, believe that the government and Merkel in particular, they have been too reluctant to embrace Biden's overtures, and they fear that the government remains frozen in a wait and see mood and attitude instead of reciprocating more forcefully. And some are reminded of the first Obama years when Chancellor Merkel was really quite reluctant to embrace Obama. She said, let's see what he can deliver. And in the end, it became a very, very close relationship. And this is reminiscent a little bit of that period. But we should not forget, as Europeans, this is probably the most transatlantic president, the US president since Bill Clinton, and we should seize the moment, because if we are just waiting and letting things drift, this might be might become a self-fulfilling prophecy, the kind of drifting apart, and we don't want to see that happening. So maybe I stop here and open the conversation. Catherine.
I'm just going to filibuster for half a minute if my internet allows, while people get in line to ask questions. I think your last point is a particularly interesting one, that the Biden administration felt that they had to make pretty concrete overtures, even if ultimately sort of minute in gesture, but the gestures were important. And the German Twitter sphere lit up after the announcement of the additional troop contingents and a number of other initiatives that the Biden administration has put forth to say, well, what should we be putting on the table? And I just wanted to ask you, Peter, from your estimation, I mean, you're really a seasoned diplomat. What is it that the Europeans should be offering right now as more of a fig leaf, but things that will actually make good progress in this transatlantic relationship. Be assertive, but be clear about interests, but then also really say, look, here are European ideas, that we could really push in the cooperation.
Yeah, I mean, I would still think, okay, we still have time. I mean, this is just 100 days, a little bit more. We also need, on a government-to-government basis, we need some more people in the bureaucracies to work on the fine print of a common agenda. So there are some excuses that are valid. I'm also expecting that the EU and the member states come up with more ideas as this first summit is approaching in June. So I believe some of the points that I made will be taken up in that agenda for the summit, especially in the field of trade and investment and taxation, where the EU is sort of in the lead. I would say from a German point of view, what we could signal more is, more on defense. Our defense secretary has sort of as a lone voice assured the U.S. that we will do our utmost to reach the 2%, which we probably will not reach in 2024, but we should be robustly on a way to that 2% goal. I think we could do more together. Well, first in the trade field, we should, and I think this is the most important issue in the medium and long term on China. But there it's about really going through all the grievances that we have from IP theft in China to cyber attacks on German companies, to forced technology transfer, to strategic acquisitions, to investment screening, etc. I mean, here we can really, I think, have a list of common approaches vis-a-vis China. Some things we will not be able to agree in the short term on China, but I think there we could have sort of an agenda with benchmarks that we can reach. I mean, there are two levels here. So the assurance, the pledge, the rhetoric, and then there is the agenda, what you can implement in terms of measures. And I think in the rhetoric, I think it was not enough what we as Europeans did. And I mean, I'm looking for reasons why there was this restraint, this sort of self-restraint. And I think it's still the European undercurrent of a skepticism. Will this last? Is this sort of a short-lived spring, the Biden hype? Will Biden be able to deliver? Is this just an intermezzo that will be over in 2 years or in 4 years? So I think this is the, by the way, the French reading. The French reading is, look, Europe is it becomes less and less and less important for the US, and this is the kind of the course of history, if you will, the course that the US will be taking in the future. it will turn to Asia, it will turn to China, and we will become less important. And therefore, we need to strengthen our, strategic autonomy. This is the French expression. I think there are a lot of people, in particular, reading the papers, what's happening domestically in the Republican Party, that are still cautious in sort of overcommitting and saying, let's see how far all those pledges of President Biden go in terms of climate, in terms of trade, et cetera, and multilateralism. So that's maybe at the backdrop of this kind of restrained and kind of wait and see attitude, which I'm not embracing and endorsing, but that's an explanation.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask everybody to go ahead and raise your electronic blue hand. I think we're all experts at doing that now. If you have your camera on, the few that do, please go ahead and do that now. I'm going to call on people in just a second, but I will filibuster one more second, Peter, because now you've come home from your diplomatic assignments and you're in Berlin. So I want to address the elephant in the room, which is to say that Germans take to the ballot box on September 26th. And the read from Washington is, or the fear from Washington is, that Germany might do what it traditionally does in an election campaign, is to fall into a political foreign policy deep freeze between now and September. So from your vantage point in Berlin, as all the parties are rallying up to present their party political programs, what's your read on that? Is that a real danger?
Yeah, I mean, it's, we've been prone to navel gazing really for quite some time, which I deplore. I think Germany, after unification, was kind of less navel gazing than it is now. And you have some factors added on to that, and that's the pandemic. Foreign policy is just not number one, page one material. It's all, the economic recovery and the pandemic and vaccination that adds on to this tendency in times of pre-election times to be focusing on domestic issues. So I couldn't contradict you that, and also, on top of that is, of course, Merkel is outgoing. She's sort of probably not opening new chapters of a very innovative foreign policy. On the other hand, one could say she could say things that are a little bit unpopular. By the way, she did this yesterday when she contradicted President Biden on the IP, the patent law of vaccinations. That was quite remarkable that she was an outlier in this. But yes, Catherine, I fear you, maybe it's not that dramatic, but I fear we will be busy with our own election campaign for the next 4 months. And depending on the result, we will have again so-called coalition negotiations that may last a couple of months. So I would not say count Germany out, but we won't be a very, a friend of bold decisions in the next month. Certainly not.
I appreciate that assessment. I'm sure we're going to talk about that more in this conversation. So I want to go ahead and go to questions, please. Always feel free to use that electronic hand or raise your hand if I can see you on the screen. Seth Johnston joining us from Washington this morning. Seth, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Catherine, and thanks to you, Mr. Ambassador. Seth Johnston here, formerly a member of this Belfer Center group and now teaching at Georgetown University. Also a U.S. Army veteran who had the honor of serving alongside German troops in Afghanistan.
Oh, I see.
And that's the subject of my question. My apologies, by the way, that poor connection prevents me from joining you by video, but thank you very much for this comprehensive review of the status of the relationship. you mentioned that there was some grumbling about the decision to withdraw U.S. and NATO forces from Afghanistan in German security circles, and I wanted to ask you about that. I think the perception here in Washington is that that was a fairly well coordinated and professionally announced decision. So if you have any more details about sort of how these consultations were received in Germany, I'd be interested to know that. But then also more broadly on security and defense, I wonder if you have anything to say about the announcement earlier this week that the United States, Canada, and Norway will be participating in the new European Union PESCO project on military mobility, and whether you expect that security and defense will be a topic of conversation more broadly in the US-EU summit that you mentioned, and how that might differ from what the security and defense agenda is at the NATO summit, also coming up in June. So thank you very much again, Mr. Ambassador. Your thoughts on security.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on Afghanistan, I think the grumblings were more sort of in the background, and I think it took the German decision makers here some time to accept a shift from condition-based withdrawal to timeline-based withdrawal. I think the orthodoxy had always been, we withdraw when the conditions are right, and not when at a specific timeline that we give. And but there was no public criticism, not from this government, and not even from opposition politicians or so. But I mean, I know, of course, that the German military forces they are dependent on the enabling capacities of the U.S., although they are just 3,500, if I'm not mistaken, on the ground. But we just cannot continue without the U.S. And also, the motto was always jointly in and jointly out, and so it will be now jointly out. But I think there are voices say, is this really the right decision? What happens if radical Islamist forces, like not only the Taliban, take over? They will not probably take over, in a big offensive, but if ISIS and Al Qaeda somehow regroup and find a refuge there again, and if another terrorist attack is emanating from Afghanistan, what happens then in our public opinions, etc.? I think those were the questions asked, but I emphasize again, this was not a public criticism, and I think most people in Germany understand that U.S. cannot stay longer than in its longest war and has to draw a line at some point. I think the public opinion understood probably better what moves the president here than some of the defense people. On PESCO, yes, I think that's an interesting development. By the way, our German defense secretary was always open and I think was pushing this participation of third countries in PESCO projects, and now it happens with this within the mobility concept of PESCO. They decided also to have a new mission in Mozambique that is open to third countries. So I think that's a very welcome development, that there is a cooperation between EU countries and non-EU countries like Norway and the US. Now, one shouldn't probably oversell this, because PESCO is a conglomerate of various, very different projects, and it's not sort of a joint European army, so to speak. It's an incremental process, nevertheless a very important process, and I'm sure it will be part either of the EU-U.S. summit or the NATO summit in June. It will be maybe not number one issue, but it will be acknowledged, and it will be welcomed, and should also be better known in the public opinion. Unfortunately, very few people know what PESCO is, quite frankly, but maybe that's an assignment for the political leaders to communicate that better.
Thank you. We're going to go next to Jose Luis de Colmenares, who's a Spanish Foreign Ministry Fellow with us this year.
Yes, I know him. We've been here on the same screen a couple of times.
Yes, thank you, Ambassador. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your very insightful presentation. It leads me to ask, I would like to ask lots of questions, but I'm going to restrict myself to just a couple, if you will allow.
Sure.
I was reading a couple of days ago an article on Barnier's new book and his opinions on the other side of the negotiating table. And my impression was that the US is clearly going to shift its special relationship further east towards the EU and quite possibly to Germany, at any rate with the current British leadership, and maybe even mid to long term as the realities impose themselves. If that is the case, how do you reconcile the fact that Germany is so dependent in its exports towards both China and Russia, with the forging of a renewed and stronger transatlantic relationship? And if I may, connected to this, do you think that now that the Trump presidency is over, there will be less support for populism in Europe? Or do you think that it's still going to remain an issue in the years to come?
Well, all extremely pertinent questions. Barnier's new book, it's quite exciting I have not read it, but I will order it, because I lived through the Brexit drama in my last years in London. It really shows a rather low point right now, at times a breakdown, and now after this trade agreement, rather a low point of trust between the UK and the rest and the EU 27. The trust level of European leaders and also the business world vis-a-vis the UK government is fairly low, and Barnier gives some quite striking examples of how the negotiation tactics of the Johnson government. But I'm not so sure whether the attention of Washington will really turn away from the UK to Paris and Berlin. I have read this a lot. I think the UK has, in the eyes of the Americans, still a lot to offer. I mean, it's a very nimble and willing security force, and it's willing to align itself with the US anytime, anywhere. As opposed to Germany, who's restricted, by law and by its political landscape to move in security matters globally. So I think yes, Biden in particular was never a fan of Brexit. He's of Irish origin partly, so his emotions probably are with the Irish and not with the British. But they will weigh in a sober way what the UK has to offer to contribute to the transatlantic relationship, and it is still quite a lot. But of course, what is totally gone is this kind of role of the UK as a broker between the US and continental Europe. We don't, not only do we not need the UK for that, we would not even accept that the UK is brokering a relationship between the EU and the US. So that role is gone. And of course, Washington knows this. UK has zero influence at this point in time for the political decision-making in the European Union. So that trump card of the UK is gone. And of course, if Washington wants to speak to the European Union, the famous Kissinger telephone number, yes, it's there, but as we've seen in Istanbul recently, there are two vying for the main chair, and the sofa gate, if you know what I mean. So there are two, the president of the council and president of the commission, vying here, I think the administration will have to call Paris and Berlin, but you are a Spanish diplomat. I would never exclude Madrid and also Rome, and everybody who and Warsaw as well. Everybody who knows the EU knows this is not a group that can be led by the French-German couple. It's much more complicated than that. So on Germany is not so much dependent on export to Russia, but with China, yes, there is a heavy dependency. I mean, we've been our exports to Russia have been going down pretty dramatically after the Ukraine crisis. We still are, German companies are still heavily invested in Russia, but I think the broader picture is that economic perspective in Russia are not very good, but in China it's quite the contrary. We've in terms of our industry, the German industry has coming out of this pandemic, or is about to come out of this pandemic relatively well because of China, because of the Chinese market, and I think this is just a given. Germany is an export-oriented economy. Europe is also an export-oriented trade bloc. So that determines to an extent also our foreign policy interests. And I think that has to be part of the equation. And your question on populism in Europe after Trump. Well, I would say the kind of, from my point of view, depressing news is that the pandemic has also brought out the most strange coalition of, anti-democratic forces, from QAnon to all kinds of conspiracy theories and to anti-Semitism, and now they don't have a friend in the White House anymore, quite the contrary, but it's still flourishing. It doesn't rattle, it doesn't shake democracy. I'm not worried about that. The AfD is sort of lingering at around 9%. It's not in Germany like the Front National, but I'm worried about the new dark side of the internet and what it does to perception of people when they look at liberal democracy. That is a worrying trend, and that's maybe not dependent on this figure of Donald Trump.
Please go ahead and be a part of this conversation. Raise your hand. Yiting's question is next. Yiting will go straight to you.
Karl Kaiser also has raised his
Oh,
hand.
fabulous. Good. Carl, we'll go Yiting and Carl, and then we'll move down the list from there.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. It's great to see you again, Ambassador. Thanks so much for being with us, and thanks so much for your insightful comments. So my question is about, as you may be aware of, China has been tapping into the advent of technology in a pretty malicious way, we'll say. For example, implementing mass surveillance and even a social credit system on its citizens. In this light, what should be considered to be the most critical thing for the EU to do, perhaps with the US, to secure a technological leadership for the liberal democratic part of the world? I think you've touched base on this, but if I may, I would love your comments specifically on the technological aspect. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think I have a ready-made response to that particular aspect that you raise, the abuse of technology for social and political control. I mean, that's a big issue in China. It might also be an issue in other countries. I think what we as Europeans, as transatlantic community, who after all shares values, what we've got to do is try to determine our standards, for instance, in AI. And you know that the European Union is quite good in regulating. Well, critics would say the EU can nothing but regulate, but we are good in regulating, for instance, the GDPR, the data protection issue. We are preparing a digital market act on the abuse of the internet for hate speech and other sort of dark activities. And I suppose we will also be at one point try to regulate the abuse of the internet or for data for governmental control. So I think what we can do here is leading by example and try to set standards that others in the world can also adhere to. And I think, you know, if it's always the case, if two powerful blocs like the US and the European Union are united, especially in those, you know, essential issues for liberal democracy, we can move the needle at least a bit. And I hope this will be happening. And I think you know, the lessons of the 6th of January are so profound in the US that I think I see no reason why we can't align on this, and I'm quite hopeful that we will. And it should also be part of the you know, promotion of democracy agenda that this administration has, I think, on its mind. I don't know how this will be spelled out, but I take it, I read that there will be a summit of democracies in the course of the second half of the year, and I'm sure those issues will be part of the agenda of such a event.
Thank you, Peter. Karl Kaiser.
Peter, I have to apologize that I had to miss your introduction. And I hope that my two questions, which I have not been dealt with already in that introduction. The one is China, back to China. Partially due to Chinese reaction to the Europeans, the sanctions in particular, the Europe and behavior with the Uyghurs, the European Parliament may not ratify the agreement between the European Union and China. And I was just wondering what that will do and how you see that, and what it will do to German Chinese policy. That's the one question. The other one is you made a brief reference to that. I think the nuclear question will come back inevitably because within the transatlantic relationship, because look, in all possible combinations of coalitions, it's either the Greens are in it or the Social Democrats or even both, who knows? But both have a problem with the nuclear question, notably the continuation of participation in decision-making, nukleare Teilhabe, what the Germans call. And that is an inevitable question because the question of modernization of the Air Force comes up and its role in nuclear deterrence on tactical weapons. And so my question to you is, how do you see this? The SPD has a problem with its left wing, and it includes the leader of the parliamentary party, and definitely the Greens have it. And Annalena Baerbock will have to face the left wing, which is anti-nuclear. People like Jürgen Trittin. And there may be even a link to the whole question of whether or not there can be an arms control dialogue on the intermediate nuclear weapons, which is a desirable issue. There had always been that underlying trend on the left, both in the Greens and in the Social Democrats, and I leave aside the Linke, that the whole issue of tactical nuclear weapons in Europe has to be dealt with in the future. So how do you see it?
Yeah, Karl, a great pleasure to see you in the first place. And thank you for those two very difficult questions. Especially the second one is a hard nut to crack, but it's important. On China, yes, I said the US and EU, Canada and UK acted in a coordinated manner when they imposed sanctions because of the Uyghurs. And China reacted, I think, in a way that was much more robust than in the past. And I think it sort of gives us an inkling what will happen in the future if we again use the sanctions tool. China will not be deferring and will not be sort of humbly accepting those sanctions, but will retaliate in a much more robust way. And I think we've seen now a new determination of the Chinese leadership to hit back if need be. And if you observe or read the 5-year plan of the Chinese, that was endorsed by the Communist Party and Parliament, and if you sort of study the rhetoric of the Chinese leadership, you can say there is this quest for self-sufficiency because China doesn't want to be vulnerable to sanctions as it used to be. So I think this is, in a way, we are entering a new territory here when it comes to a sanctions tit for tat. And in a way, it was also surprising that China, in its reaction, listed persons that were, parliamentarians, members of the government, think tanks. One of our most, outstanding China think tank, MERIX, really a world-class think tank, but independent, was censored, was covered by the sanctions, and all that are clear messages. And also by sanctioning European parliamentarians, they should have known, or they probably knew that this is your point, that this would endanger the ratification of this CAI. Now, there's still, CAI was an agreement on principle after 7 years of negotiations. It's not yet, the negotiations are not yet concluded. There are still, a couple of fine print points to finalize, and it won't be ready until 2020. It won't be ready for ratification next year, before next year. So there's still sort of some time for cooling down. But I agree with you, ratification has become much more difficult in the European Parliament, and there will be some there will have to be some kind of gesture in order to pacify the European Parliament. Otherwise, they will not fly. This CAI has met with a lot of criticism. I personally believe it was the right thing to do by the European Union. After 7 years, we could not and should not have waited for the Biden administration to be in place. I think it also was a sign that the EU is its own master in terms of trade policy. We are a superpower in trade, and we want to use this to become also a geopolitical force. So I think all those critics who said we should have waited and asked the US whether this is okay, this agreement, I think is illusionary. The US would not have done this the other way around. They would have not waited for Macron and Merkel to be in place after an election before they conclude a trade agreement. So this has not convinced me. But to your question, I think unless something of a gesture on the Chinese part, maybe taking back those sanctions, reneging on them, without that, I see high hurdles for ratification of this. Now, the other question is almost impossible for me to answer, with the exception that you are right to put up here a lot of question marks whether this will be can be maintained, nukleare Teilhabe, participation, and with the SPD, it was sort of the kind of pacifist wing that put pressure on the government, and the government just basically also, the foreign minister, who was part of the social democratic foreign minister, basically ignored this. They were sitting this out. They basically, tried to gloss over it without, they were cautious not to raise this or turn this into a big public debate. They just sort of covered it by ignoring it. But it will be more difficult with the Green Party, and you are exactly right, a Green Party that is very kind of pragmatic in its leadership. The two co-leaders, and Frau Baerbock is, sensible and pragmatic, a very pro-European leader, but will they be able to act in government without their party base? And the first litmus test will, of course, be the so-called coalition agreement, where this will probably be part and parcel, and one can foresee incredibly difficult discussions for such a coalition when it has to find a line on the nuclear weapons inside Germany, the tactical nuclear weapons. So I think you're totally right to highlight that. And again here, I want to emphasize foreign policy with the Greens will become more complicated in the traditional sense. It will be a policy human rights first, and that will clash with, let's say, economic interests in China, and this will be quite a difficult balancing act for the next government, no doubt about it.
And could it not also be possible that all these difficulties will come out in the electoral campaign, because the other parties will ask these questions, and perhaps that will take a percentage off from the Greens, because it will come out that there are unresolved internal discrepancies within the Greens. And
yeah, I mean, I believe I of course no crystal ball here, but I think the Greens will not hold on to their high polling that they have right now. And in the past, they have always, at this point in time, sort of 5-6 months before the elections, they polled incredibly well, and their result was much lower in the end than the pollings. And this might not happen so drastically here, but they're now standing at 25%. They even have overtaken, Merkel's party. I don't think they can maintain that. But there will be a strong force in German politics in the next years, and this is the kind of this is mainstream now in Germany. The kind of climate protection first, and this is a tremendously strong groundswell of opinion, and even European opinion. But I believe they will not. That's my. If I had to put my money on some horse, I would not say Baerbock will be chancellor. I don't think this will happen.
Seth, do you want to come in straight on that?
Thank you. Just a quick two-finger on the nuclear question to make sure I understood it. And I thank Karl Kaiser for raising this issue. Do I understand that the issue about nuclear weapons in the German public debate is really limited to this question of whether Germany will participate in NATO nuclear sharing and this sort of, relatively narrow issue of Air Force modernization? Or is there a broader public interest in Germany about nuclear weapons vis-a-vis arms control? There's a big discussion, of course, here in Washington, D.C. about the extension of the New START treaty, but also just the whole issue of the nuclear nonproliferation and arms control regime generally, which has deteriorated so much with the end of the INF treaty in particular. I'm thinking about whether that issue is one that resonates in the German public debate. Thank you.
Yeah, Seth, you're right. I mean, this the tactical nuclear weapons become an issue when the opponents raise it and say, we want to get rid of all nuclear weapons on German soil. And then many people don't even know that there are nuclear weapons on German soil. And if you tell, the elder generation that have still memories of the war, and you tell that to sort of young green pacifist-minded people, they say, yes, of course, we should get rid of nuclear weapons on our soil. We are not a nuclear weapons state, and of course, I'm in favor of getting rid of all nuclear weapons. So it's a very catchy topic that can garner immediately a lot of support from people who never thought about nuclear weapons. So the more traction this gets, probably the more anti-nuclear the man on the street will become, because he's never heard of this and is against nuclear weapons in general. Now, INF is the more important issue, I would say, and I think here. We are threatened by Russia's intermediate nuclear forces, and I think this is something that can well become an issue. Shouldn't we restart and reinvigorate INF negotiations? I think, and that is a legitimate subject. That's a legitimate topic, and I think you will hear more about that in the coming month, emanating from Europe. Everybody was happy that Biden, first thing, prolonged the New START treaty, and that was a great relief to many people here. And I think the INF, if that could be, reinvigorated, it would, meet the applause of many decision makers and observers of defense issues in this part of the world.
I don't know if you guys can hear me. My internet is being fickle again. But on that point, we had a very interesting discussion.
Where are you, Catherine? Where are you?
I'm in Cambridge. No, I'm in Cambridge, or in Somerville, but my internet apparently is in the third electronic world or something like that. Okay. Just on that note, we had a very interesting event this past week with the former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, Rose Gottemoeller, who addressed, specifically that issue with an expert panel.
We can't hear you.
We can't read her lips either.
In the meantime, does anyone else have any questions? Don't be shy.
Well, I just want to say it must be hard for you to say goodbye to Catherine, because she will be moving to Berlin, and we'll have her here at the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Auswärtige Politik, and I'm glad to see her at the helm of this important institution. It needs some strong woman, although her predecessor has also been a strong woman, but it needs for the next trajectory a person like Catherine, and a great transatlanticist. So I feel very good about that choice, and can't wait to welcome Catherine in Berlin rather sooner than later. I see a raised hand by Jose Luis.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm going to take advantage of this glitch in Catherine's internet provider to ask you further about Nord Stream 2. What do you think? Do you think that Nord Stream 2 actually will provide Germany a negotiating tool vis-a-vis Russia, more than Russians being able to exert a degree of influence in Europe? Do you think that maybe the way to do that is not to be completely under Russian control in this particular sector, and perhaps further developing the 3 Cs initiative. Do you think that could be a way forward?
This Nord Stream issue is somehow it is fraught with so many conditions and aspects that I would not dare to prognosticate where this is headed, and I think there are so many divergent interests here, and the most likely scenario for me is that it will not be resolved anytime soon. My preference would be to finish it and then not to sort of use it, but then start a negotiation with like the one we had before, a couple of years before, to turn this into a project not of the 5 big companies that European companies that have stakes in that, and of course Gazprom and the Russian government, but to have sort of, I use this word, a multi-stakeholder interest in this. And you might remember that Germany first said, look, this is a purely commercial project. And then at one point, 2 years ago, Chancellor Merkel said, well, this has divided Europe to a certain extent. Let's take an initiative and reassure Ukraine that it will not suffer from, loss of transfer income, through its Ukrainian pipeline. And then with the help of the European Union, there was a negotiation with Russia. And I think it was led by Dombrovskis at the time, or Yevkovich, the commissioner. And they indeed forged some kind of agreement that gave certain reassurances to the Ukraine. And also, tried to incentivize investors in modernizing this Ukrainian pipeline, which badly needs repair. So I think the only way to do this, to get this up and running, is by having a buy-in of other countries here and other stakeholders. Other than that, it will be a divisive factor, even more so now with a deterioration of the German-Russian relationship. Don't forget, that's an interesting aside here, a footnote. It was Merkel who brought Navalny to Berlin. She was the one saying, this is this guy who's dying in Siberia, in this hospital, and said, let's bring him over. We take him here. And so she knew full well what that meant. It meant that Navalny case became, for weeks, the biggest issue between the European Union and Russia, and it triggered this sanctions round. So I think she must have known, and I'm sure she knew, that with that, Nord Stream would be entangled into that crisis. So that is now the case, and the suspicion against Putin's Russia here is really hot, and it's. On the other hand, Germany, I don't know whether everybody knows, but there are some federal states, the Eastern federal states really have long-standing traditions, cultural ties, but also economic ties to Russia. Don't forget, all the East Germans, their first mother tongue was not English, but Russian. They still have that those ties to Russia. So they are not very easy to cut. But in general, our perception of Putin's Russia has become more and more critical, and Nord Stream has sort of been dragged into that vortex.
So if anyone has any further comments, please now, or hold your peace. Okay.
I thank you for being here and taking part in that little conversation. Carl, it's always such a pleasure to see you. I'm so unhappy that I couldn't come and visit you because of the pandemic. I would have liked to spend some weeks and interact with you, but maybe sometime. I have a teaching assignment now with Georgetown, so I will come 1 week per month. I will spend in DC. So maybe we have the chance also with Erica and with others who live in Cambridge to meet maybe.
And
Johnson, looking forward to seeing you in Georgetown.
You can come up.
Can you repeat that? Because some other.
And we hope we'll see you in Cambridge when you are going to Washington. You can always come up here.
Well,
right?
Same here.
Very good.
On behalf of the project, Ambassador Wittig, I want to thank you for your fellowship, which was done totally online. You've done so much for us. You've held office hours. You've spoken in multiple seminars. You've held 2 different study groups on a wide range of issues. And we'd like to thank you very much for all you contributed. We would love to see you in person, conditions allowing, as soon as it's possible. We'd love to have you come up to Cambridge. And on behalf of the project, just thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Erica. We should set up a meeting on Cyprus.
I'd love to.
We have a Cyprus history. She's researching on Cyprus, and I was ambassador to Cyprus long time ago. Okay.
I'd love to. Thank you all very much. Have a great weekend.
Same to you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.